Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 13th live stream Fighting COVID Together with Minister of Health Jens Spahn. I'm Julia Kropf and I'm pleased to lead you through the 2 hours that we will spend together. We're going to talk about boosters and predominantly, of course, we received some more questions, but we are predominantly talking about the booster shots and your questions about that topic. We were here in June, that was the last time, and we were reluctantly optimistic with regard to COVID. And today we can say the situation is tense or even dramatic. The number of people who are infected with COVID is soaring, and severe disease courses are increasing. The intensive care units in some regions are already at their limits, and there are still too many citizens who don't get vaccinated, and the immunization of those who receive their shots first is decreasing, and we have a new mutation. And this is a situation against the backdrop of which we're going to talk about the booster shots that are one possibility to overcome the fourth wave. The Standing Committee on Vaccination recommends the booster vaccination for people older than 18, and you sent us many questions with regard to that, and we're going to speak about it, the receiving the booster, at what point in time, how long is protection lasting, and we're also talking about the vaccination status, the vaccination mandate, and questions around boosters in the case of a pregnancy. You sent us almost 4,000 questions in the run-up to this conference, and we will tackle these questions, and I'm very pleased that we again will hear this session in 4 languages: Turkish, Arabic, English and Russian, and sign language. We have a large group of experts who are with us today, and I'd like to introduce them to you. First and foremost, of course, our host, the Federal Minister of Health, Mr. Jens Spahn. Hello, everybody. And then Leif Erik Sander, he's the head of the research group on infection immunology at the Charité in Berlin. It's nice to have you here. And as we are in a smaller room today, and as we are abiding by the restrictions with regard to contacts, we are only 3 people here, and we have 4 experts that are connected to us digitally. Professor Dr. Klaus Zischotek, head of the Paul-Ehrlich Institute. Welcome. Professor Dr. Lothar Wieler, president of the Robert Koch Institute. Hello, Mr. Wieler. And I'd like to welcome Professor Dr. Lena Büchs, chairwoman of the German Ethics Council. Hello, Ms. Büchs. And I'd also like to welcome very warmly Dr. Dirk Heinrich. He's chairman of the board of the German Association of Medical Specialists, SPIFA, and he's also a physician, a general practitioner with his own practice in Hamburg. And he also was the head of the largest vaccination center, Mr. Heinrich. At least you claim it to be the largest one. We never said so. The media always reported like that. 11,000 vaccinations per day. That was our peak value. And it was a very large vaccination center. And we vaccinated 1.2 million, or we performed 1.2 million vaccinations with 6.5 million people. There was one large vaccination center in Hamburg in the trade fair premises. Yes, let's start before speaking to the people here before we tackle the questions. Boosters will be our focus topic. Why is it important to mention that topic at the beginning? Well, we already planned this 3 or 4 weeks ago. The situation was different than the situation is today, unfortunately, because the topic of booster shots has become more important because we have more knowledge on the topic. You have to see the sequence. In summer, we realized that booster vaccinations are good for elderly people, 60-plus people with underlying conditions, and for medical professionals. And ever since then, it's been recommended to vaccinate. And then there was the beginning of the 4th wave and data that reached us from Israel, and this showed us that in the case of the Delta variant, even those who have been vaccinated after a certain period of time become part of the infection process. They are more likely again to get infected and to also pass it on to others. And this is why it makes sense to vaccinate all those who are older than 18 years old a 3rd time, so a booster shot. And this gives rise to many questions. People want to be informed about what kind of vaccine for who, and in parallel to that, in some regions, we see some dramatic developments in that fourth wave we are in. Yesterday, in the Münsterland region, we had to transfer patients by airplane from the south of Germany. That was unnecessary before, and it shows very clearly how much stress there is on the clinics in the region. And it's really important, and it's an opportunity to do that today and to show that very clearly, that in our everyday life, we really make a difference. We have to reduce contacts again. You might remember the last time we got together here in June, a high vaccination rate, and it makes a difference. And getting a vaccination really makes a difference. It provides a lot of protection for those who are vaccinated. But given the Delta variant and the fact that we can be more infectious again, and the fact that rules like 3G, recovered, vaccinated, or tested, this isn't respected sufficiently, and so this is everything we're going to talk about today, the booster shots, and we are also going to talk about the overall situation. We realize on a daily basis in our ministry, the hotlines, wherever you are, there are many questions again. Professor Sander, Mr. Spahn mentioned already, immunization of vaccinated people decreases after a certain period of time. Why is that the case? I mean, we all hoped, well, doubly vaccinated, great. This is not the case. Where first and foremost, we have to say that after an acute immune reaction, after an infection or a vaccination, the immune system ramps up fully, and then it goes back to a basic state. Antibodies decrease. We saw that at an early point in time already. That was expected by everybody who is an expert in that field, and then it stabilizes. And this might be enough with regard to certain pathogens, but this pathogen is extremely infectious. And then there was this combination of the decrease of antibody levels in the body, and then there's this new variant. We had the Alpha variant first, and now Delta. Delta is very contagious, and the risk of being infected is higher. And to add to that, in some strata of society, the elderly people, for instance, and there are studies we carried out in Berlin, the 2 vaccinations might not have been enough. You couldn't see that at an early point in time. But we realized that vaccinating twice isn't enough, and this is why the 3rd shot is recommended. Again, it's still a very high level if you compare it to the vaccination against the flu. It's still a high level of protection that you have with 2 shots. But still, it's a very dangerous virus, and this is why the booster shot is very important, and it will help us because as we're talking about new variants, we see that the booster vaccination is very important, particularly for the elderly because they have a high risk of a severe cause of the disease, but it's also important for the other members of our society to have a high level of protection. In the course of our conversation, we're going to talk about the new variant and vaccinations. I think that you were really busy these last 2 days, and I'm sure we're going to speak about that later on. Mr. Zischotek, you have expressed yourself in the media on a regular basis in a very positive manner, very optimistic about the high efficiency of the vaccines that are available, and it's been mentioned a moment ago as well. Can you give us more insights about this? Why do you have that positive attitude? Where does it come from? On the one hand, we have highly efficient vaccines, the best substances in the world, and to a sufficient degree. And there were studies that were carried out in the run-up to the approval with more than 10,000 patients and people who took part in the studies. And it became evident that after the approval, the high efficacy still is given, 80 to 90%, depending on whether we're talking about a vector or an mRNA substance. And after the approval of the substances, this has proven to be true. And the safety of the vaccines, of course, we all know that there can be some reactions to the vaccination in the first 3 to 5 days, but speaking about severe side effects, the rate is very low, more than 10 out of 10,000. These are extremely good levels, and it couldn't be any better. And as you said already, the booster vaccination will be an additional plus, a clear plus, particularly in the among the senior citizens, very old citizens, and where the initial immunization didn't really happen, wasn't that effective, or the immune response has already decreased. And we can guess that by boosting the vaccination and the protection can gain strength. So the interim conclusion is that vaccinating is great, but we have to vaccinate more, and we have to have more time. We need more people who are willing to be boosted and to be vaccinated. Dr. Heinrich, you represent the German Association of Medical Specialists. You represent the interests of specialists in clinics and practices. And you have your own practice in Hamburg, as we have mentioned already. And the medical profession is being strongly challenged again in this fourth wave. How do you and your colleagues experience the current situation and the everyday life of your colleagues? Well, we are seeing a rush with regard to the appointments for vaccinations. There was a clear increase in the last couple of days, in the last week. And we've ordered much more vaccine, and we have provided more possibilities to vaccinate. And there are more colleagues again who participate in the vaccination rollout. We cannot satisfy all the demand immediately. We don't have the volume, the amount of vaccine that we would like to have, and this was a matter of discussion in the last couple of weeks. But now, there's a high demand, and our colleagues are willing to vaccinate, so this works quite well. What happens is that we don't have that prioritization according to age anymore. Whoever wants to have an appointment can get one. I would like more people 70 plus to call us so that we can vaccinate that group again with the booster. And if everybody else wants to have a vaccination, of course they can have that shot as well. Professor Bux, we were speaking about medical and scientific aspects first. But the longer the pandemic is, the more effect there is in society. There is an impact on all of us. How do you perceive the current situation, and how is this being discussed on the Ethics Council? Thank you very much, and hello to everybody. I'd like to start on a positive note. Mr. Heinrich mentioned it already. We can see with all the indicators that you can measure that the willingness to be vaccinated is increasing again. At the same time, we have to state very clearly that it's a difficult situation for our society. On the one hand, there is a major concern. We all know that vaccinating is the way out of the pandemic, but if the vaccination rates are not high enough, the situation can get really bad. And many people are experiencing that in many different regions. In my own federated state, in Bavaria, the situation is really, really extremely difficult. And this is why we're here today, to speak about the importance of the booster today. This is really important for the elderly and for those who are very vulnerable. And then there's a second aspect. There are still considerable vaccination gaps, if you want to call it that way. And in society, for a very long time, there was a strong discussion around how to motivate more people to get their shot. We were looking at those who haven't been vaccinated yet for understandable reasons. But what we perceive in the last couple of weeks more strongly is that the vast majority is asking itself how it is possible that we are in such a bad situation again. And the voices are getting louder. And the burden sharing is considered to not be fair anymore. And this is changing the situation in society with a view to the measures that will be needed justifiedly in future. Well, this is also being discussed in the social media, that things are changing. Professor Wieler, the fourth wave, we are in the midst of it, and it has its firm grip on us, and the number of infections is rising. What will be important in the coming days and weeks? And I almost don't dare ask you because you've repeated it so many times, but what is important in the next couple of days and weeks?
Now, first of all, I would like to thank you that we can meet again in this group here. It's really important, and I really hope that a lot of people have tuned in and will have the opportunity to ask questions. There are three things that will be crucial and that are crucial and that we are lucky to be able to do because we have been vaccinating now for almost a year, since the 27th of December last year. The first and most important thing is to stop the spread of the virus. We know that it spreads through contacts indoors, through aerosols. So the most important thing would be to not have big gatherings, no big events indoors, and we have known this for a very long time. Actually, everybody who has really looked into the virus seriously knows this. Reducing contacts as far as possible is the most decisive factor, because this will result in fewer infections. I want to make one thing very clear. We cannot take back all the infections that have happened. And there are certain consequences and repercussions based on this, that are people that will be sent to hospitals or that will die. We cannot take that back, so we have to stop now in order to prevent future cases. The two other factors are what we are here to talk about today, and that's vaccinating, and then two more aspects, that's closing these vaccination gaps, because the majority of this pandemic is being caused by people who have not been vaccinated yet now. There was just a new study that has shown this with German data referring to Germany. We have to close these vaccine gaps. There are more than 15 million people over the age of 12 in Germany who have not been vaccinated yet. That's a huge part of the population. It's too many people. And by making this part smaller, we can reduce the risk of infection too. It helps people, but it will also not only help individuals, but society as a whole. And the third factor is the booster shot. And I think Mr. Sander actually said everything that there is to be said. You should get a booster because the protection decreases over time. But the most important thing here is, though, to know that the protection is still very high and it protects from very severe courses of disease. And that's also really important because people don't get so ill anymore. But over time, the longer it's been since the last vaccination, the protection against an infection decreases. So I would really like to focus on one thing, and that it is important. It does matter whether we have 2G or 3G events. Independent of that, everyone who's there should wear masks if possible, because masks really protect. They also reduce the risk of infection. So to put it in a nutshell, we know exactly what we have to do. So please, let's do it together. Let's vaccinate as many people as possible, make it possible to get a vaccine. And I'm really delighted that the willingness to get a vaccine also in currently non-vaccinated people has increased, and people understand that this is a huge challenge. Just to give you a figure that's really recent, in the past days we have had 450,000 first vaccinations. That's a clear and significant increase, more than 0.5% of the population who have now decided to get vaccinated. Of course, it's not enough because infections are still soaring, but we can see that there's a lot of pressure through the overall situation. People hope that the vaccination, that they understand that the vaccination protects. And I have said in the past, I would love to take unvaccinated people to the ICU and show them the suffering that's happening there. So this brings people to get the vaccine now. And I talked to 2 or 3 colleagues earlier in the federal states that are now working with 2G or 2G plus. And there are some people who now say, I want to get vaccine so I can still participate in everyday life. And so this really changes the dynamics of the vaccines, the vaccinations, and people get more shots now. But still, there are many questions, and we would like to tackle them today together with our experts and really go on a deep dive here. You have sent us so many questions. Before this event, we have received almost 4,000 questions on our website, and I hope you will understand that we cannot answer all of these questions in the 2 hours that we have. We group them into topics, and of course there have been repetitions. So this is what we're here for today. So I have a collection of questions here, but I also have my tablet here, so we can still take questions live during this show. And so we can include these in the show. We will also have enough vaccines. If you are here as a guest, as a foreigner, a doctor will probably still give you a vaccination. But in general, the rule is that if you it's to today, it's more or less 6 months. And if you're aged 60 or older, if you need any additional medical attention, if you're in a nursing home or medical staff, we also recommend the booster vaccination after 5 months. So for the average 30-year-old, for example, 6 months is enough to get a booster, but for someone who's older, who has an underlying medical condition, etc., they can also get their vaccine earlier. And this is exactly what doctors do now. They prioritize these groups for the booster shots now so they can be protected. Okay, so everyone aged 18 or older can get a booster after 6 months. And one more thing, sorry for interrupting you. These 5 to 6 months are important because the doctors who have practices are contacting us now that people want their booster shots after 2 or 3 or 4 months. And I would really like to ask everyone for their understanding and comprehension here. It doesn't make a lot of sense to get a booster after 2 or 3 months because you're still very well protected from your first 2 vaccines. And there's also another thing playing into this, and that is that we have to do this in the best possible way, and that means that those who were vaccinated first and were vaccinated like 6 months ago, or more than 6 months, now it's their turn, and those who were vaccinated 2 months ago should not call their doctors now, please. Mr. Heinrich is nodding his head, so it really seems to be the case. We'll get back to this later, actually. Mr. Sander, you raised your hand, and I also wanted to ask you something. Yes, I would like to add one thing, because it's really important to me. Every day I hear 5 to 10 questions along the lines of I'm not vaccinated because of this or that medical condition, and my doctors were not sure, and so they didn't vaccinate me. But one thing is clear, there are hardly any contraindications against the vaccination. That means almost everyone can get it. The Bionic Pfizer vaccine, for example, if you have an intolerance or a very high sensitivity and an allergy, again, one of the ingredients, and this has nothing to do with a hay fever, for example, then you should be careful. And actually people with underlying medical conditions are exactly the group that should be vaccinated, but unfortunately they are often not vaccinated because their doctors were not sure, because, for example, they have cancer, these patients, and so the patients talk to the doctors, and we want to make sure that they know this is important, the vaccination is important. Of course, it's hard for the patients to point their doctor's attention to this, so we really have to communicate this information to doctors in the first place. But Mr. Sander, I also would like to know if the booster shot is only fully effective after 14 days, like the other vaccines. We think at the moment that the protection, there's a full protection faster than in the initial immunization, because if the body doesn't know the virus yet, it takes longer for the body to assemble the tools and to build this protective shield. For the booster, it works faster. There have been several studies have been done, but I would say 5 to 10 days is the period of time until we can see a clear additional protective effect that continues to build after that, so it works a bit faster, and this is why boosters are so important. It's a great tool, it works very fast, we just have to get it to the people. Mr. Zichutek, we also got another question that said, will the booster vaccination will finally protect us from getting infected with the virus? Are we no longer transmitters for the virus? Because we have heard several times that even being vaccinated, we can pass on the virus. Does this still apply to people who have received a booster shot, or is this then a thing of the past? We don't have a final opinion on this yet, but I think the situation will be similar to the initial immunization. So yes, it can happen that vaccinated people can be infected and can pass on an infection, but for a way shorter period of time than unvaccinated people. So this is the good news. And to the question, when you have protection, immunization, we have seen that it takes about 7 days. We have very high immunization response here, like we have seen after the initial immunization. Okay, if I got it right, Mr. Sand and Mr. Zichutek, the booster vaccination decreases the risk to get infected as a vaccinated person and also to pass on the infection, right? This is one of the goals. Yes, you're right. The risk is decreased a lot, also looking at the Delta variant, and it protects you even better against a symptomatic infection. So people who have had their booster shot or have a good initial immunizations will have very few symptoms or no symptoms at all. So it really protects against COVID. But yes, it also really helps against an infection in general, but it can also the protection is less good against an infection in general. But how long does the booster vaccination effect really last? How long will the booster protect me? Does this depend on the vaccine that I receive? And what will the future look like? Will we have to get a booster all the time? Or are 3 shots enough? Is this something we know at this moment? Mr. Sander, Mr. Zichutek, you probably know that. Professor Sander. Oh, Mr. Zichutek, sure. Thank you. I think at the moment we will probably be at peace for the six next months. And this also depends on the concentration of antibodies in the blood. There's a huge significant increase after the booster shots, and the protection also only decreases gradually. But we are hoping, as I've said, that you are protected for 6 more months. And one more thing, we're always talking about antibody levels, but we also have a cellular immune response that really helps very much. And the initial immunization plus the booster shot help to build an immunomemory. So your immune system will remember the virus and it can then react faster even if it encounters new variants. What do you mean with the cellular response? Well, by that I mean that once we have been vaccinated or have been infected, there's a certain cell type reacting to this, and it then gives antibodies into the blood that catch the virus and prevent it from entering new cells. And there's a cellular part, immunocells, that then recognize infected cells inside the body and can remove them. And this gives an additional protection on top of the other physiological effects of the infection. And there's also a memory of the immune system. And so your body remembers that it has encountered this pathogen before with a spike protein, for example, and if the infection was long ago, it can still act faster than in people who have never encountered the vaccine, the virus, who haven't been vaccinated or infected.
Well, listening to you, we can only say that the body is a miracle. Mr. Sander, there is a question on this cluster. This brings us to Omicron, the new variant. The variant isn't effective against the new variant. There was a full stop here, but we don't know that actually. And why keep vaccinating, although there are new variants and it's ineffective? Well, the vaccines were developed against the original type, which was identified in China. At the point in time when the genomic sequence was identified, the manufacturers like Bionic, Pfizer could start developing their vaccines. The virus developed and changed in some locations. Fortunately, our immune system is built in a way that it can act against many parts of the virus, give an immune response. There are different weapons, so to speak. We have the antibodies and we have other cells that identify different parts of the virus. And this is why this original vaccine that was developed against the original virus can also be effective. And now we have new variants, and there are many changes, mutations at locations our best antibodies can bind with. So there are different aspects that come to play. But this is just a sequence of letters that allows us to conclude that it might be that some of the antibodies don't bind that well. But our body develops many different antibodies and has, in addition to that, has these cells, and they recognize other locations in the virus than the antibodies. So we always have dual protection. There is cellular immunity that Mr. Zischutek has mentioned, and I'm sure that this is still valid for the Omicron as well as for the Delta variant. And this helps us when the virus penetrates the body and leads to lung failure. Our body cells can still help. So we are optimistic that we will not start from scratch with that new variant. And in addition to that, thanks to the booster, we can increase our immunization way above and beyond the initial immunization and stop the variants. With regard to Omicron, we cannot say it yet. There are no experiments that would have been carried out conclusively in the laboratories in the world. We don't know yet whether the antibodies can bind. We'll have to be patient for a little while. The boosters will keep on being important, particularly with regard to the variants. They give protection. Whether or not the vaccine will have to be adapted, this remains to be seen. This is why we cannot really say yet how long the booster will be effective, but at this point in time, it is very important. Let me add something, because the question is asked oftentimes. Do we have enough vaccine? Do we have a vaccine for the variant? Yes, we will have one, even if it has to be adapted. With the European Union, we ordered for 2022 and 2023, independently of the variants. We are talking to Bionic, Pfizer. We ordered 2 billion doses for 2 years. This is enough to vaccinate all the European citizens 5 times almost. And if there is a variant, we will be able to react quickly and ramp up our production facilities and have enough capacities. So there's research underway in how far the vaccine has to be adapted. Let's speak about the topic of cross-vaccinations. This is also a question that is asked very often, and I'd like to show a graph on that matter, on the topic of vector vaccinations, cross-vaccinations. Yes, this one. Can we have a look at that, please? There are studies that point to heterologous booster being better than homologous boostering. Mr. Heinrich, I'm sure that this is a question you are confronted with very often. What is the right vaccine after having been vaccinated with this or that substance first? Mr. Spahn, can you explain the graph to us? And then, Mr. Heinrich, can you comment on that question? Well, as we have been administering AstraZeneca for quite a while, I've also been vaccinated once with AstraZeneca and my parents as well. And this goes for many people in Germany. Also, many nurses and medical professionals were vaccinated with AstraZeneca first. And there are those who were administered AstraZeneca twice, and then we have experienced many things this year already, but you might remember that the recommendation had changed, and younger people were given an mRNA vaccine after AstraZeneca as a first shot, Moderna or Pfizer. So there are people who have already been administered two different vaccines, and now there will be the booster shot, and there will be those who will have received AstraZeneca, Bionic, so Pfizer, and Moderna as a sequence of vaccines. That's no problem. But there are those, and this someone else can say something about that in a moment. A mix might be better with regard to the immune response. But the graph just shows the different patterns. One is missing, mRNA, 2 times mRNA. That's the biggest group in Germany. And Johnson & Johnson, this is also important, this is the vaccine which is effective for full immunization after one shot. And looking to Delta and the current situation, it does make sense to only wait for weeks to have a second shot, so the booster shot with an mRNA vaccine. Before giving the floor to the immunologists, Mr. Heinrich, how do you view that topic? And your patients, how do they approach you with that insecurity? What is the right thing? First, homologous vaccination, and then Moderna instead of Pfizer, BioNTech. How do you view this? The biggest difficulty is that BioNTech has established such a wonderful reputation in Germany that it was difficult to sell Moderna as a booster vaccine because BioNTech Pfizer has such a sensational reputation. So now we have to inform the people about the fact that cross vaccinations are good or even better. That's very important. Because we don't only have BioNTech, but we have a lot of Moderna at our disposal, which will no longer be able to be used next year because it will expire. And this is why it is decisive to state that cross-vaccinations are good. There are indicators that say that it's even better, and this is why those people who have an initial immunization with BioNTech, it's good to have the booster with Moderna. This is a very important message to propagate, and if you said that in public, that would make life easier for our colleagues in the private practices, because otherwise they will have to discuss that with the patients because they believe that BioNTech is the better substance. And so it would be good if Mr. Sander or Mr. Zischotek would state officially that cross-vaccination is a good thing and that Moderna is very well suited as a booster for those who were vaccinated with BioNTech first. Mr. Sander, you didn't say it that way, but you said take whatever you can get. So there are no differences with regard to the effect. No. What is important is that you get your booster. You can take 1 or 2 mRNA vaccines. They are equivalent. There are studies that say that if you give the one first and the other one second, that might give us an advantage. That's interesting from a scientific point of view, but for the people out there, it doesn't make a difference. You need the booster. The booster shot gives you 10 times or 20 times more immunization against the disease. And infection, this is an effect that you want to have with one single dose. It's important, particularly in winter and the high infection rates. So if there is an appointment available, take it, accept it, and take whatever is available. And you can do that without having any concerns because both substances work very well. We have an additional question, and I'm very pleased that we have our first guest and connected to us, and I see her on screen already. Annegret Bönke, thank you very much for being with us. We're looking forward to your question, and the experts here will try to answer your question to the best of their ability. Thank you very much for having me. I have undergone an odyssey. I belong to that small group of people who have had an allergic shock after a medication with PEG. I was vaccinated twice with AstraZeneca, and I cannot have the booster shot as it was just described. And now I have the possibility to be vaccinated a third time with AstraZeneca, but I've read that what the gentleman of the Paul-Ehrlich Institute, I don't remember your name, what he said, that antibodies react to the fact that this protection cannot be built. So the question is, what can I do? What can I do for the future, as the mRNA vaccines haven't been recommended to me? Mr. Zischutek, can you take that question, please? Has the question become clear? It has become clear. What do you answer? Well, we don't have any data that would show that this allergic shock can be displayed time and time again. And there are no allergies, run-of-the-mill allergies, that should react. But if you had that reaction, I would recommend to take a vector vaccine for that vaccination, and to make sure that you stay in the practice for at least 30 minutes, so as to that the physician can intervene. But just a point of clarification with regard to the booster shot. The STIKO recommends the 2 mRNA vaccines for people who are younger than 30 years. They recommend Comirnaty because there is a nuance with regard to side effects that can be avoided. Have I understood you correctly? So you will be vaccinated a third time with AstraZeneca or not? I have the possibility, but my question is if that is effective. Mr. Sander, can you take that? Well, there are studies that show that a third AstraZeneca vaccination will increase the protection clearly. Theoretically speaking, it would be even good to combine it with Johnson & Johnson, because then you'd have 2 different vectors that could be more effective. These are special cases that you would have to look into. But 3 times AstraZeneca, there's data from the UK that show that immunization clearly rises. So you do good to you. Johnson & Johnson was approved for... It hasn't been approved yet, but AstraZeneca or Johnson & Johnson would be an option, right? If I understand it correctly. How could you turn to, if there are these special cases or special questions? Is it the general practitioner, or maybe it's too much to ask of your GP? Who could people turn to? Well, of course, you should have a look at what the STIKO recommends, but these are isolated special cases. Usually the university clinics have experts close by. Of course, they cannot tackle all the individual cases. But and the Robert Koch Institute also has information material. If you have a very special case, you don't necessarily find it on the internet. And you'd have to turn to a university clinic close by. Or your doctor maybe knows colleagues they could ask. The Paul-Ehrlich Institute also has a lot of information on their website. Ms. Bönke, thank you very much for being here. Can I just say something? So AstraZeneca is not available anymore. I called many places. It's very difficult to get a grip on AstraZeneca. Practices tell us it's no longer demanded and no longer ordered. This is the biggest problem. Minister Spahn is going to give an answer to that personally, and I'd like to thank you for being with us, and all the best. Ms. Bönke, this is a question that affects some people. AstraZeneca is no longer part of our vaccination campaign. There are some stocks in individual practices or vaccination centers, but that's not a lot anymore. But things are that's still supplied is Johnson & Johnson. If your physician orders Johnson & Johnson, it will be available and will be delivered via the pharmacy, and you could use that one as the vector vaccine. That would be the easiest solution for Ms. Böhnke and the general practitioner.
And we move right on to the next question, and that is about how you prepare for the booster shot. Welcome, Gisela Schwab, who is here with us live now, and there she is. Hi, Ms. Schwab. I would like to know something about antibody tests before a booster shot. I will get my booster shot soon. I have been vaccinated twice with Moderna, but I would like to get the boost after 5 months now. I'm 59 years old, but I am worried that now after 5 months I could have side effects. So I would like to know if it would make sense to have an antibody test at my physician's. Who would like to answer? Mr. Zichutek? Mr. Wheeler? First of all, I would like to say that there won't be side effects after 5 months. It happens much sooner. And on top of that, the STIKO recommends at least 4 months after the initial immunization. 6 months is the rule now, and we know that the double vaccine with mRNA or Moderna is very effective, so you probably still have time. And we know also based on clinical studies that the double vaccination really results in very good antibody levels, but we don't know the precise antibody level that results in a protection, and so it doesn't make any sense to have an antibody test. Just follow the recommendations by the STIKO, follow the prioritization, and get your booster shot after 6 months with one of the mRNA vaccines. And the two vaccines are definitely interchangeable here when it comes to mRNA. They're both excellent. Ms. Schwab, if I got it right, because you were also worried about side effects, right? I have heard people who were worried about the level of antibodies and then add a booster shot on this, that this could cause problems or stronger side effects. I don't know if that is what you are worrying about too. Yes, I am. This is what I have experienced, that people say, okay, I have so many antibodies and then I get a booster shot. Can something happen? Maybe Dr. Sander can also say something about this. The third vaccination is usually well tolerated. The side effects will be similar to those you had after the second vaccination. That is what we have seen in our own studies too, very comparable to the second vaccination. So the mRNA vaccines, of course, they can result in reactions. They are not the same for everyone. You can get a headache or have symptoms like in a flu, but usually the booster shot symptoms are not stronger than after the second vaccination. You will get half the dose of the second shot for the booster, so you actually don't have to be worried at all. Once these 5 months are over and you look to get an appointment now, it's actually the perfect moment. So good news for you, Ms. Schwab. All the best for you. Mr. Heinrich, you wanted to say something, but first of all, thank you, Ms. Schwab. That's a very important message here that we are sending out. The antibody level does not indicate if you should get a booster. We sometimes can do this for other vaccinations where antibody levels are indicators, but this is not the case for the COVID vaccines. Don't do this test because it doesn't help at all. But this is basically also what Mr. Spahn wanted to know. It's not dangerous to get a booster shot after 4 or 5 months when you still have a lot of antibodies, right? Nothing can happen there. No, it's not dangerous, I think. In Israel, they also didn't take antibody tests, and you can see the vaccine reactions independent of the booster. If you do the boosters right, you will have similar reactions like you had after the second shot. You don't have to worry at all. The only exception where antibody level tests are important, and doctors know this, are in the case of immunocompromised patients, for example, who have had an organ transplant, for example. In this case, doctors want to know whether the vaccine has worked, and they also look at the antibody levels sooner than in other people. But for the general population, you don't need an antibody test. Now, the right moment for the booster shot is actually something that many, many people wanted to know more about. Just to quote a few of the questions, you can only get a booster after 6 months. In the vaccination centers, for example, it's only allowed after 6 months. I'm reading out what's written in the question. But the effect of the vaccine decreases after 4 months, and you have seen this in many studies in the past. Based on the information by the Ministry of Health, they might recommend a booster after 5 months. So am I eligible to get a booster after 5 months, or can every doctor decide on their own how they would like to handle this? First of all, now if you look at the vaccination centers or some GP practices or other practices, they really stick to the date in order to also keep on top of the situation, because you have to keep in mind, if we want to be honest and just describe what happens without any reproaches or anything, we discussed for a very long time about these STIKO recommendations over 60s, over 70s. Maybe we started this debate too late. And now we have a lot of people who want to get a vaccination. There's a lot of traffic in the vaccination centers and in the practices. Of course, it's easier if you have a set date like 6 months, because you can sort of control the flows. But in general, it's a doctor who decides. And if they say, okay, I will give boosters after 5 months and 1 week, and even if they said, okay, I'm going to do it earlier, it's their decision, it's the doctor's decision. Of course, these 6 months are a rule of thumb. But what I find really important for younger people and also without underlying conditions, if they wait for 7 months, it will not be dramatic. Not everyone has to get their booster shot in the next 4 weeks. We actually have to do it step by step, and ideally as many people as possible will be vaccinated, everyone who has been vaccinated, and ideally everyone should get vaccinated, but everyone who should get a booster can usually also wait if they don't have a special indication. Mr. Heinrich, so will each of your colleagues decide that for themselves? Because some say, okay, everyone can come to me after 4 months. Others really stick to this order. What is your perception looking at your colleagues? Well, it really differs. It's different for everyone. But in the end, it's like Minister Spahn just said. Medical aspects mix here with other aspects. And it's possible after 4 months or 5 months. 6 is the rule. And then you also have hands-on practical issues, of course. So doctors have to look at, okay, how can I vaccinate as many people as possible, how I can vaccinate most vulnerable groups first, and this also leads to rules that every doctor has in their practice. So some will say, okay, we'll do it after 6 months so that those who are eligible first can get their booster shot first. So there's really a mix between what's possible and what's being done in practice in the real world in order for all this to work. Dr. Bix, actually we're looking at, okay, how fast should this work? Will I get my boost after 4, 5, or 6 months? Who's eligible first? Of course, there are so many concerns here and so many rules. How do you speak about this in the Ethics Council, or is this something you talk about at all? Are you discussing this at all, this order, or also this question of solidarity? Mr. Spahn pointed to this earlier. How much are you looking into this? Thank you. This is, of course, something that we don't look at at this granular level. This is just not our job in the Ethics Council, but we have talked to colleagues, because this can also be compared to initial situations. I would say a rule of thumb actually works best. Of course, it's most important to vaccinate the most vulnerable groups first. And we have the mobile vaccination teams here, and they have been working on this for a while. And doctors in their practices also should try and make sure that the oldest patients, the most vulnerable groups, get their booster shots first. The groups who have had their first shot or second shot a long time ago. And as Mr. Spahn said, people shouldn't run into the practice after 2 or 3 months. So we have a basic rule that those who are most at risk should be boosted as fast as possible, and then we can go down based on the age, for example, but there won't be any new prioritization. I think this would make things even more complicated and slow down the process. So we have to be pragmatic here. I think everyone can decide on an individual level. If I'm 40 years old and it's been 4 months since my second shot, if it's month 6 and I'm 60 years old, it's my turn. So just be streetwise. If I may add something also very streetwise, we had a prioritization in Germany until mid-July, more or less, and then it took 4 to 6 weeks to get the second shot. So if you add 6 months to that, we are still within the 6 months rule until the end of December, and it actually has an inherent prioritization because those that reach the 6 months first are the ones who also got their first and second shot first. So I think this really applies at least until the end of the year. And if we look beyond that, okay, for who has it been more than 6 months, we will see 25 or 30 million people in Germany. As of today, we have administered about 8.5 million booster shots. There are around 3 million booster shots currently administered per week, and the number is increasing. Capacities are being stepped up, so I think we will more or less be able to administer the booster shot to everyone after 6 months, plus minus. Of course, we're also talking about the Bionic deliveries. This has been hotly debated this week, and this has hindered the whole process, unfortunately, but we have to use Moderna now in order to keep and stick to our goals and reach our goals. So I would just like to thank everyone who's working at the vaccination centers, in doctors' practices, people who are dealing with the patients. It's not easy, I know that, but I can also see how the system is getting stronger day by day, and we can administer more and more vaccinations every day again. So I'm confident that everyone who should get a second shot after 6 months will get a booster shot by the end of the year, for everyone whose turn it is now. I would like to add one more thing, and it fits perfectly now, because even friends and family often ask me, well, I could get a booster shot now, or I brought my mom to the practice and the doctor also gave me my booster. Did I do something wrong? Should I feel bad? And then I always have to say, no, not at all. Because Mr. Heinrich just said that beautifully, the whole system is very complex. You don't help anyone if a doctor is offering you a vaccine and you turn that down, because you could get a boost after 5 months, but I'm not going to take it. That doesn't mean that someone else would get it. It is possible this is a dose that should be vaccinated that day and otherwise will go to waste. Or there are practice internal reasons because all the older patients have been vaccinated, so this particular practice can vaccinate younger people. So if you have the chance to get your booster shot, take it. Because in the end, it's true that it also applies to the booster shots. After 5 or 6 months, every booster shot helps. So don't be shy, so to speak, and stick to the 6 months more or less, because we can really rely on that. So everything into the arms, that was the hashtag here, just to sum it up. Mr. Wheeler, I'm always excited when people ask me for my vaccination certificate and the app that I can show them, but people also wanted to know if I will lose the certificate if I don't get a booster shot after 6 months, if I don't get an appointment after 6 months. Will I then no longer have a certificate and no longer be immunized?
Well, that's the good question. Are we talking about the legal protection? The certificates that there are valid for more or less a year. Everyone who has had a vaccine be administered knows the exact date. It's 1 year later when it will be obsolete. But the question is if the validity of the certificate will be shortened, and these are reflections that are underway because of the available data. We'll see how long the certificates will still be valid. There will be a transitory period, but one thing is clear. If the data solidifies that the immunization decreases faster than we thought a year ago, the validity of the certificate will be shorter. But these are reflections that are currently underway, and they will be the results will be communicated, but we will assume that it's not going to be a year of validity in future. But this is currently being talked about. This legal matter is a good question. The certificates are valid for a year, but this will certainly be reduced. Mr. Spahn, you wanted to say something. Some first federal states don't accept the yellow certificate, a vaccination certificate anymore, because everybody can go to the pharmacy to have this digital certificate, because it's easier to check, and there is the app free of charge. I mean, everybody can check it, and you can have your certificate in digital form. It's very important that as many people as possible have that certificate. I hope that we would stick to 2G for a long time, also after this wave, to apply this principle of being recovered or vaccinated. And as Mr. Wieler said before, how long will the certificate be valid? At European level, we are discussing it. It's also been mentioned in the media. We're talking about a 9 months period. We are also talking to the ECDC, the European Robert Koch Institute, and the national authorities as well. We would like to have a uniform solution in Europe. I live close to the Dutch border, and if there's a different validity, a different expiry date, if you live next to the border, that's kind of complicated. So a uniform deadline would be good, and we're not going to, and that's very important, we're not going to introduce it overnight. We want everybody to have the opportunity to have the booster vaccination first. We're not going to say those who've been vaccinated will still have the certificate, the others will no longer have a valid certificate. We want everybody to have the opportunity to have the booster shot first. So these are the reflections and considerations that are currently underway, but I'm sure that the validity of the certificate will be adapted to the immunization. One question before we connect to a guest again. This is also the period of time where there is the vaccination against the flu. I had a flu shot last week. Can I still have a booster shot? Mr. Zischutek, I'm looking at you. What about the intervals? Well, in principle, it's an opportunity missed. It would have been nice to have the shot against the flu and the booster at the same time. Normally, the interval is 3 weeks, and then you can also have the flu shot. We haven't seen any major interactions between the two. We will have the same degree of protection, and the side effects are also comparable. I heard 2 weeks, so it's either at the same time, you do it at the same time, or with an interval of 2 or 3 weeks. 2 to 3 weeks. That is the rule of thumb. But it's not 1 week, because that was the specific question. 1 week isn't good. 1 week is too early, because we need to give time to our immune system to come to terms with the vaccination and to react. So this is why the interval of 2 or 3 weeks is recommended. Well, so either at the same time or after 2 to 3 weeks. So this gives a clear answer to that question, and I'm very pleased to have another guest connected to us. And it's Dr. Anne Albus. She's connected to us. Hello, I can see you already. It's nice to have you. What's your question? Good afternoon, everybody. My question has to do with the booster of those who have recovered, who have their first time, single dose after 6 months, and there is no booster recommendation by STIKO. And sometimes severe infections and a one-off vaccination is deemed to be the best protection against COVID, and some patients have not tolerated well that single dose after having been infected, but there are elderly people who didn't have a severe cause of the disease and were vaccinated after 6 months, and they are worried now that they will be infected with the Delta variant. They would like to have a booster shot, and the environment also pressurizes them to have the booster. For instance, if they have to go to hospital for a surgery, and there is no recommendation by STIKO, can this be changed? Who would like to take that question? Mr. Sander. Well, you're right in saying that this combination of having recovered from the disease and having had one single dose, this single dose is very important because not everybody builds up a lot of antibodies, a lot of protection after having been infected. And then there are many studies that show that you are well protected. You also have a neutralizing power by the antibodies that are built, and this is why the current STIKO recommendation is that no booster is recommended for these people. You should watch this and observe it, and if we see that there are breakthrough infections in that group, you can adapt the booster recommendation quite easily. And the other way around, there are many people who have recovered who were vaccinated twice, and there is no risk involved. And there are also people who didn't know that they had been infected because they didn't have any symptoms or weren't tested, and then they were given the booster. There is no safety risk, but the current recommendation is that you don't need this booster shot at this point in time. For now, those who are very elderly or have an underlying condition, they need the booster. And also those who had the second vaccination 6 months ago. I'm also a person who has recovered, but it doesn't do any harm to be vaccinated again. No, it doesn't do any harm, and there are those who have been vaccinated twice because they didn't know about that recommendation. You just went to have your booster shot or the second vaccination, and it was well tolerated. It's not dangerous at all, but immunological data show that one dose is enough, and we have to administer the booster to the others, so there's no urgency. Thank you very much, Dr. Albus. My assumption is that the answer was helpful. Yes, the answer did help me. I have a comment. Is there any plan to have single vaccinations? Because for us on the countryside, in our practice, it would be good to have single doses, because very often unvaccinated people come to our practice, and then you convince them of being vaccinated after exhaustive conversations, particularly now as there is 3G, and they would be willing to be vaccinated. But then I tell them, I can only give an appointment for this in the faraway future. It's difficult. And unfortunately, we don't have the vaccination center anymore, and it's only open 3 days per week, and it's difficult you can't get there with public transport, and so it would be easy. So for all those who don't know exactly what that meant, you have always have a batch or a lot of 5 doses. Can you please explain it, Mr. Spahn? Well, at the beginning we had 5 doses in one vial. Usually it's now 6, and for BioNTech or Moderna, for the boosters, it's even 20 doses in one vial. So you just gave a real-life example in the rural areas on the countryside. You just convinced somebody, but if I can convince 5 more people, I don't know. And that's the fact, that's the problem. We talk to the manufacturers because it's their decision to have individual doses in a vial. That happens with other vaccines as well. But now they are telling us that they have to make sure that the whole world can be vaccinated. So they have to produce, they have to maintain the maximum production possible. They don't want to produce individual doses. So as to be able to support the vaccination campaigns in other regions of the world. So we're discussing it, but it's not being part of an approval process. I don't know if Professor Zischutek knows more about that with regard to the approval. No, what you said is correct. For the reasons you said, you have 5, 6, or 7 doses in a vial. So the world that has been vaccinated already wants to have individual doses, but the rest of the world says it's more important that we have more vaccine. And we have to enter into that compromise as long as we still have the situation in the world. But I understand you very well. I come from the countryside as well, and such is life there. And I hope that you'll be able to... No, unfortunately, I can't succeed because it's so difficult to order. I have to order it 2 weeks in advance, and I only get 24 doses of Bionic. No, it's difficult. Thank you very much for being with us, Ms. Albus, and for asking your questions that are interesting to many people. On the topic of being recovered and having recovered and being vaccinated, there were many questions that reached us. Mr. Sander, did I understand you correctly that there is no boost recommendation for those who have recovered and have been vaccinated once? Well, if you will, being vaccinated after having recovered is a kind of booster. It brings about a high level of immunization, and the antibodies you build can be compared to the third vaccination. For instance, if you administer an mRNA substance, this is the same level of protection. Of course, we have to look at the numbers, the variants, etc. You can see that having undergone an infection and then a vaccination, there might be a decrease in the immunization. We would observe that and adapt the recommendation if necessary. But it doesn't do any harm to be boosted, but there are other priorities. And this is my statement on that for now, and then we would have to analyze when did infection happen, when was the vaccination, etc. So there are some more specific questions for a person who has been fully vaccinated below the age of 60, no underlying conditions, and a breakthrough infection after 2.5 months. Do you recommend a booster? Well, you can say that if the breakthrough infection, there are new findings, brand new findings on that. I just saw them a couple of days ago. There were people who had been vaccinated, they had a breakthrough infection, and this stimulates the immune system a lot. It's like a booster vaccination, actually. This is what we are currently looking into, and the antibody responses seem to be stronger, more pronounced, because the body confronts the virus again. You don't get sick or hardly show any symptoms. Luckily, this is why you have the initial immunization through the vaccination, but the protection is increasing. And if you had that breakthrough infection after a complete immunization, you don't necessarily need a booster right away. That's unnecessary. There are more questions that reached us live. I was vaccinated in May 2021 with Johnson & Johnson, and a week ago, again, I've been vaccinated with Bionic. Does it have to be a second Bionic? Do you need a second Bionic vaccination for full immunization? Mr. Zischutek? No. This is a full immunization, and after 6 months, like recommended, you should think about a booster shot. But am I understanding you correctly that Johnson & Johnson is deemed to be vaccinated once? It's not a double vaccination. So if I want to booster in that scheme, it's Johnson & Johnson plus mRNA booster. Is that correct? Yes. At the moment, the recommendation is that giving Johnson & Johnson once, that seemed to be enough, but now we are saying 4 weeks afterwards you should booster with mRNA, and then another booster after another 6 months only. So this means, as a follow-up question, if you've received Johnson & Johnson, according to the latest findings, it's deemed to be 1 shot, not 2, like it was originally thought. Yes, the results show, particularly against the backdrop of the Delta variant, that Johnson & Johnson is approved as a single dose, but it's recommendable to booster with mRNA vaccine. So this concludes the initial immunization, as it is done with the other substances where 2 shots were recommended from the outset. I have another question. In addition to BioNTech, I've read that Moderna will only deliver it to a lower quantity as ordered. How is that possible now as we should booster? Is that the correct information? Well, this is a good opportunity to show you the scope. Our vaccination rollout in the last 3 or 4 weeks has multiplied by 10, and this shows the sheer speed. But of course, let's say starting in summer until the beginning of fall, and we only received orders of 500,000 doses per week, and now we are at 10 million doses that have been ordered on Monday. I mean, this is a logistical challenge. And nothing was reduced in terms of deliveries with Moderna. This is a topic of logistics. It might take a day or two longer. And it might also have to do with the ordering process. I don't want to dwell on the details. I receive many text messages from minister presidents, from physicians, and sometimes Mr. Heinrich also sends me a text message telling me what's going on site. And whenever I look into that, I see that the ordering process usually was well established, that if you have to order by Tuesday for the next week, but then the physicians order on Wednesday and Thursday, and then the next week the product isn't delivered. And we try to do everything to change it. It's a matter of logistics. With regard to the volumes, this week, let's say it's Saturday afternoon, in Germany we will have had 3.5 million vaccinations this week, since Monday. And on Monday, we delivered a total of 7 million doses. This means that half of what was delivered has been vaccinated, and on Monday and Tuesday we will deliver another 11 million. So this means that within 10 days we will have delivered almost 18 million doses, half BioNTech, half Moderna, and 3.5 of the doses have been administered until today. So this means at the beginning of next week there are 14 million doses circulating, so to speak, that have been transported or will be transported to the location where it will be administered. This is quite a huge number. We can administer the vaccine to many people, but still it can happen that at local level or regional level, due to logistics via the wholesale trade and pharmacies, a supply will not happen fully. I mean, this can happen, and I can't gloss that over, but we deliver as many doses as we haven't delivered to that extent since June, and people have to administer that.
Mr. Heinrich, this doesn't sound like a little, doesn't it? No, you're right, and it's good. That's actually good news. Of course, there are logistic problems as well, but the number of vaccinating doctors has increased a lot. We have around 100,000 doctors in Germany included in the vaccination campaign, and that's more than we had at the peak of the vaccination campaign. So I'm really optimistic that the campaign will really gain speed in the next 1 or 2 weeks. So there are millions of vaccine doses waiting to be administered, and they will be administered. I just think there are logistical problems here. Delivery was hard, but I'm really optimistic that the vaccination campaign will now be boosted, so to speak. We at my practice, we are also vaccinating on Saturdays now. In Hamburg, there are also special campaigns for the December weekends, so we are really creating opportunities so people who are maybe at work the whole week can go and get their shot on the weekend, and we will have that until the holidays and even beyond that. And I really hope that this will help us to vaccinate these large amounts. It will be a big win. And of course, I really still hope that a lot of unvaccinated people will decide to finally get vaccinated, because we talked about this in the beginning. This would really help to curb the fourth wave long term. Well, Mr. Wheeler, what do you think? Now, looking at facts and figures, how many first vaccinations have we had? What's the relation between boosters, first and second vaccinations? Because this is something Mr. Heinrich also just said, this is really crucial. We don't only have to booster, but we have to convince people who haven't been vaccinated yet. Well, at the moment, we're looking at the following situation. The situation is shifting. We have more and more people who have been vaccinated once. There's still a lot more booster vaccinations, but luckily the number of first vaccinations also increases. And it is decisive that all three things happen at once: reducing contacts, second, initial immunization of everyone who hasn't been immunized yet, and third, booster vaccinations. This has to happen in a parallel way. We are monitoring this, of course, but independent of our monitoring is that people get their shots. I would like to point something very smart that Mr. Sander just said. He said that once you have been vaccinated, and maybe even if after 8 or 9 months the immunization effect decreases, you don't start from scratch again. If these people get their booster shot after more than 7 months, for example, if they don't have this very excellent protection they would have had if they had gotten a booster, they are still much better protected against an infection than those who haven't been vaccinated at all. And this is really the decisive message and information we have to get out here. I don't know if we're going to talk about new variants later on, but everyone who will get vaccinated or has been vaccinated, don't start from scratch if they are infected with a new variant, because they have a certain level of protection, and this is the only way out of this pandemic. And so this is really important. We have to vaccinate as many people as possible, and the more people are not vaccinated, the longer it will take for this pandemic to end. And the more people are vaccinated, the faster this pandemic will turn into an epidemic, an endemic. Mr. Spahn, you wanted to add something, but I would actually like to ask Ms. Büchs, because we are talking about those who haven't been vaccinated yet at all. What are maybe communication tools, what are the best arguments that we can bring forward at this point in time to convince people? Are people actually worried? Do we have to provide better information? What's your take on this? What are the arguments? Well, I'm of course referring to the work of my colleagues, Ms. Beach, for example, from Erfurt, who has looked into this for a very long time, because I don't work on this myself. We know that there are different types of vaccine skeptics. There's one group, and I will just say it, just call it that way, they have built a wall around themselves, and it's really hard to reach them because they have this very close-minded mindsetting at the moment. And it's much more worthwhile to focus on everyone who's hesitating, who's unsure, and doesn't really know if they should get a vaccine. And there are many, many people in this group. There are young women who still, even if it's wrong, who are still worried about their fertility. This is not true. This is wrong. And there are great information, pieces of information out there online. There are other groups. Just think of this very famous football player, that there are long-term effects, but we can explain this beautifully. This is not true. This will not be the case. And there are still, surprisingly, a lot of people who have really pragmatic reasons, who said they just didn't have the time, who have a lot of friends that have a certain influence on them and have convinced them not to get vaccinated. But this is why I can say communicating on all channels is important, and doctors actually have most influence here because people trust them the most. But each and every one of us, every individual in all contexts, in associations, in clubs, in businesses, people who are in contact with a lot of people, you can be influential. You can have a very low threshold communication foundation and reach a lot of people, and this is what we are seeing also at the moment. And one last thing, of course, pressure also helps. The pressure that we are building by well-controlled 2G or 3G models, because many people are realizing how annoying it is to get tested all the time and that it makes more sense to be vaccinated. And actually, one last thing, even if it's depressing and frustrating, I think there are some people who only now understand how dire the situation is when they hear that ICUs are filling up with unvaccinated people and are really fighting for their lives. So I think this is a very graphic example. I am reluctantly optimistic that we can turn this around, that we will reach people and unvaccinated people can be convinced, will get vaccinated. But at the same time, of course, I'm really worried looking at the current situation, because we really have to act fast now. The situation is very difficult. Mr. Zichutek, did you want to say something? Or did you just touch your glasses? No, I didn't want to add anything. I just touched my glasses, sorry. Mr. Spahn. Yes, I wanted to refer back to the facts and figures because I looked into them this morning again. We have about 60 million people who have had one shot. And this is a large part of 83 million, of course. And regarding the group of under 18-year-olds, we have about 11.5 million who haven't been vaccinated, and then 9 million children who cannot be vaccinated yet. So we have about 11 or 12 million adult people who have not been vaccinated yet. And then you think, okay, how is that even possible? It's only 11 million people. At the moment, we see about 0.8 people of people that have been infected that have to go to ICU. And if we look at 12 million people, that are still 100,000 people. And 100,000 people on ICU. If we didn't do anything here, that would push our system to the breaking point. We are not able to provide for all of them. Our system is under pressure already because we have a lot of other patients too who have cancer, who have had a stroke, etc. We want to take care of them too. And I think this really illustrates that these 12 million non-vaccinated adults are just way too many. So we really have to use all channels, all options. We just also have to look at the images that we're seeing. The German Air Force is transferring patients from one hospital to the other. We just have to let that sink in. What does that mean for the EU, for Germany? I really hope that these images really flip a switch in some people and that they understand that vaccinations are a good thing. Yeah, and what you said, the Charité Hospital in Berlin, they have postponed or cancelled elective surgeries now because it's not possible to take care of all the patients and there's not enough room on the ICUs anymore. Well, in parts of the country, the regular medical care that we know is not happening anymore. And why is that? Because so many people have fallen ill with COVID and have to be treated. The situation is pretty bad in Berlin, but it's even worse in Saxony or Bavaria, for example. Of course, we're talking about elective surgery here, but this is because you have to plan surgeries that are really necessary. There are medical reasons why you're planning surgeries. I recently talked to a colleague at the Charité, and even people who just break a leg run into problems now. They often have to go to several hospitals now because they can't be treated at any hospital. And the COVID situation just makes this worse. And as Mr. Wheeler said, this will just become worse. So we have 4,000 people that are hospitalized at the moment with COVID, and this will get worse. So everyone who gets a vaccine now, who gets a booster now, who wants to obtain information here, they are also at risk to not get the medical care that they need and that they are used to. So it's really important to convince these last 11 million people, because there are way too many people. A colleague of us has really calculated all of this. If you combine the numbers, it's actually the unvaccinated people who dictate what happens regarding the surge in infections. And the more infectious the variants get, the easier they will get to unvaccinated people. For the measles, for example, the virus always finds the people who haven't been vaccinated. So it's really important to have an enormously good vaccine coverage and convince as many people as possible. Okay, you also wanted to say something, Mr. Heinrich and Ms. Büchs? I'll be brief. I just want to also refer this, what we just heard from Mr. Sander, to society. This is the reason why more and more people understandably say, this can't be real, this can't be true. I'm actually seeing this in Munich here at the Isar River. Our university clinic there has problems. They have to send away people who have had a stroke, for example. They cannot be taken care of anymore. They have to reorganize. This can't be true. We cannot allow this. This cannot be the effect of people saying, I don't want to get a vaccine, I can't get vaccinated. So it is really extremely important to do what Mr. Wheeler said, do all these three things at once. We have to reduce our number of contacts in order to protect our hospitals. This is a very acute problem. And we have to booster, and we have to vaccine more people in general. Otherwise, we'll not get out of this pandemic. So there's really also a social component to this. Mr. Heinrich. Well, everything we've heard is completely true. The situation is very dramatic, but we have to look at what we can do on top of that. And I think there's one more aspect that's really important. Hamburg has a good strategy here, and that is actually going to the people. We have to leave the vaccination centers or the doctors' practices and really go to the market squares, to the mosque, to sports clubs with mobile vaccination teams and really reach people where they just naturally are. We in Hamburg have had a health kiosk, so we vaccinate people directly at the marketplace, at the market square. We took them into the kiosk and vaccinated them there. These are people who don't read a lot of German media or watch German TV. They don't have a lot of contact to the regular world of information in this country, and we really have to take them on board too and reach them, and this is what we have to do, and I think we can do more here, and this would be a great contribution in order to reach unvaccinated people. Mrs. Birks is nodding her head, thumbs up, and this brings us to the next point.
And there were many questions on that. Where can we get our booster and our vaccination? I'd like to summarize some questions that were asked. We urgently need mobile vaccination centers for the facilities, for the people we work with. Our staff doesn't have the time to stand in line for 3 hours to be vaccinated, so mobile vaccination teams, that's one aspect. Then there's another question. As an outpatient rehab center, are we allowed to campaign for vaccinations? Are we allowed to do that? Our physicians and nurses, can we also vaccinate our physicians and nurses? So there were many questions about where can we get the booster, and vaccination centers were closed down. There's a huge rush into the GP practices. I don't know if that's a lady here. So my GP refuses to give me the third vaccination because I didn't have the first 2 shots be administered with her. How can I get my shot soon, and the booster, etc.? These are very Candassian questions. And we have another graph you can use for your answer, Minister Spahn. Where can we get the booster? Where can people get the booster? Where we can have a look at it together, and you can give us an answer, and the others can also answer. Well, in principle, it is as it used to be. The general practitioners, the specialists, can also vaccinate as Mr. Heinrich, and then the company doctors, they can participate right away and order the vaccine. Some companies have started that again. The question was that was just asked, how can we give a shot to our staff? And there are corporations also with regard to that. I talked to some company doctors and their association these days, and there are companies that say, I only want to do that with Bionic in my company. And then we say, hey guys, this is the pandemic, and we have to do the right thing, and we do have a vaccine that is effective. We have 2 vaccines, Moderna and Bionic. So please don't tell me that you'll only administer Bionic Pfizer in your company. This is not what we need. So the GPs, the specialist doctors, and the company doctors, and then there are the vaccination centers and the mobile vaccination teams. The vaccination centers are being built again, not the central centers, the large ones, but smaller entities. When I go to the ministry, every morning there is a vaccination point. In Berlin, there is a queue of 10 people in the morning, and the vaccine is administered there. There are also mobile teams. One thing that's new that we started over the summer is that the health offices, the rehab institutions, they can not only administer the vaccine to their own staff, but they can also go into the hospitals if they have the resources. The problem is that they are very much under pressure at this point in time, but they can also administer the vaccine and submit the possibility to have appointments. So there are many different entities and places in Germany where you can be vaccinated, and even the Workers' Welfare Association is looking into that question. And of course, the physicians can also administer the vaccine. So the question whether I can only go to the GP who gave me the first or second shot, of course you don't have to go to the same physician. That would be weird if you could only get the booster if you had the first and second shot with the same practitioner. This must be an exception, I'd say. I wouldn't accept that. This is rather a hint you should change the GP. So thank you for that graph. We can change the view again back to us, Mr. Heinrich. There are different ways of proceeding amongst the physicians, and this is being discussed very much. And there was an emotional feedback with regard to the live stream today. So many questions with regard to Bionic, Moderna, the deliveries. If we can't have these vaccines, we're going to stop vaccinating. How much emotion do you notice, and how do you react to the feedback you get from your colleagues? Well, it is an emotional discussion that's underway. You must consider the fact that the physicians have been vaccinating for months, and this is an activity they carry out in addition to the normal work taking care of their patients. And this is a huge challenge, and it's a lot of work and a huge effort for the employees, the nurses, and this group of people working in the private practices. They are largely underestimated and underappreciated. So a bonus for the employees in the practices would absolutely be necessary. We cannot only talking about long-term care or nursing care in the hospitals, and of course I'm in favor of that as well, but this personnel isn't appreciated enough. And if there are additional difficulties that appear with regard to deliveries or other questions that aren't really communicated explicitly and unequivocally, this leads to an additional workload in the practices, and this is tiring. This is a cumbersome undertaking, and then it might happen that a family doctor practice doesn't vaccinate anymore, that they can't do it anymore. And I really have to ask you for your understanding, and we have to send a clear signal that we appreciate this group of workers much more than we've done so far. Mr. Spahn, you want to comment on that? First off, it's absolutely accurate. We saw that when we included the practices, in addition to the 400,000 vaccination centers, there were 70,000 additional vaccination centers meaning the practices. And this really made a difference, and it still makes a difference, and I'm really grateful for that. And I have had different phone calls and conversations with the associations of the specialist workers in the practices. And Ms. Heinrich is accurate, because the employees have to cope with all the emotions and the way they're being dealt with and the lot of stress they encounter. I mean, it happens to us as well when we go to the supermarket. We see the person at the checkout. I mean, and there's a lot of emotions, and sometimes people don't realize anymore that there are other people who also have problems or difficult situations, and the people in the practices have to cope with that. So we raised the remuneration from 20 to 28 per shot and 36 euros per shot on the weekends. And maybe it is possible to pay a little more money to your staff in the practice, 8 euros, for instance, that you have in addition to the original price. Now I would like to connect with someone else who's connected to us via video. Ms. Büchs already mentioned the worries and concerns in the context of the vaccination, and she mentioned that pregnant women or women who want to become pregnant are wondering about the vaccine. So we have Marlene connected to us, and I'd like you to ask a question. It's nice that you're with us. Hello, everybody. My name is Marlene. I'm quite pregnant and doubly vaccinated. And the booster vaccination is supposed to take place in that period of time when I will give birth, when I'm due. And so I was wondering if it's better to be vaccinated while still pregnant or whilst breastfeeding, if that's better to protect the baby. Mr. Zichotek, this is within the scope of your competences, right? Well, we could say that it is recommended to be vaccinated whilst pregnant as of the second third of your pregnancy, and I'd recommend you to wait until after the birth of your child. In both cases, certain initial immunization will be passed on to the baby. We know that from other vaccinations. This hasn't been examined specifically for the case of COVID, and there's nothing that would be against a booster vaccination, which is recommended by the by STIKO, which is recommended as of the second trimester. So there is nothing that would be against having a vaccination or a booster vaccination after the as of the second term. This is good news, isn't it? That hasn't really answered whether it's better or not for the baby to be vaccinated whilst pregnant or whilst breastfeeding. Can you say something, Mr. Zichotek? We don't really know that in detail. I think that in both cases we can say that the mother whilst breastfeeding will transfer the antibodies to the child. Well, we also know that in other regions of the world this is a very important topic in other contexts, and I think we should proceed to vaccination, and there isn't a clear differentiation between what helps the baby more. Mrs. Anna, do you want to say something? Well, in your specific case, in speaking in more general terms, the booster is recommended also during pregnancy. The Standing Committee also states that. But we see that there are many pregnant people, women who haven't been vaccinated. You have had your shot, that's great. But it's very important, let me emphasize. Antibodies you build can be passed on to the unborn baby during pregnancy. This is a very good thing, and independently from that, of the point in time when you get the shot, antibodies can also be transferred through the mother's milk. So if there's enough time, you can do it before, you can do it afterwards. You are well protected, and the baby will be protected because it's connected to you. It will receive the antibodies, and in your case, we are talking about nuances. Thank you very much, Marlene, and all the best for you and your baby. Thank you. Ms. Büchs, you already mentioned it before when I asked you the question about convincing people to get their shot in the first place. And this also has to do with information. Maybe there's a lack of information. And I'd like to ask you to be brief in your answers. There's one question that reached us. Why is there no vaccine that is fully approved? And the person says, if I'm informed correctly, all the vaccines only have a conditional approval. When will there be a full approval? Is that an accurate statement? And if so, what does that mean? Do you want to answer? I can take that question, and Mr. Zichotek is part of the approval authority. He can also say something. We didn't proceed to an emergency approval like the other countries. Last year, this was a discussion towards the end of the year. No, we didn't do that because trust is important, trust into the vaccine. This is why we want to have a regular approval, but it's a conditional approval, a conditional authorization, and the condition is that the companies have to keep delivering study data to the approval authority. So it's not over the duty of the companies as the approval is given. They have to keep collecting data so that the authority can assess the data. But we've had billions of shots in the world and millions of shots with the vaccines in Germany, and we know their effects. They are fantastic, as has been described, much better than we were was to be expected in the efficiency, but also with regard to the side effects and the risks. There are side effects, but they are very low, particularly if you compare it to other vaccines. So we have a conditional approval. So we have a full approval, but the condition is that the companies have to keep delivering data. But Professor Cichotek can say something about that. Please be brief, if possible. Well, the most important thing is that the conditional approval is as good as the full approval. We've chosen that path, as Minister Spahn has said already, in order to have studies be continued after the approval on the efficacy and tolerability. And this conditional approval, well, we have the advantage that we can follow up and ask or impose new conditions, and we can also ask a risk-benefit analysis again after a year after the approval. So that's the reason, so there's no need to worry. The conditional approval is as good as a full approval.
I think we can even say that there have been fewer vaccines in the history of mankind that have been so well examined like this one, because there are so many studies that have been evaluated in the whole world by professors and other experts. This is a first. And I don't think any vaccine has been this well examined, and there hasn't been so much data on any vaccine, even after decades, like for this decade, like for this vaccine after just 1 year. And Mr. Sander has read them all, right? Okay, so another question. There's a rumor that's very persistent. Is it safe that the COVID vaccination cannot change the DNA of human beings? We hear that question a lot. Mr. Sander? Yes, this is also a question for Mr. Cichotek. We know the safety data. We know them very well. We have received a lot of data in observations, in studies with people who have received the vaccine. And we have seen that severe complications are very rare, and they are not more than in unvaccinated populations. So the vaccines are safe. Of course, there are always theoretical ideas about this DNA and this mRNA and whether it can be integrated into our DNA. There are theoretical approaches about this, but it's not genetic material. It's just a blueprint for the virus, and it's incorporated by the body and then also disappears again very fast. And there are no signs or indications at all that this can change our DNA. This seems to be a great platform to achieve a strong response, strong immunization, and it's also easy to adapt the vaccines, and we don't have any indication that it changes our DNA. Okay, I would like to address another question that we have heard several times, and that's a vaccine mandate. It can be a general mandate or just for certain professions. Ms. Books, in the Ethics Council, you especially looked at job-related vaccine mandates, and how much have you looked into general vaccine mandates as well? How are you talking and discussing this? And in which nuances you probably have different opinions in the ethics councils on this? Yes, well, not too long ago we issued a brief statement on the job or profession related or facility related vaccine mandate. We think we should look into this very fast because it is about people who have a certain job-related responsibility because they take care of very vulnerable people. And this is something that has become important for this fourth wave. And this is being dealt with. Regarding a general vaccine mandate, I want to be open. 1 year ago, when we talked about this, we were very reluctant, and we had good reason for this. But we are starting to consider it. There are hot debates about this at the Ethics Council. Different colleagues have different opinions. Some of them have talked to the media, and we have a plurality of opinions. I will not say what my opinion is. We don't have a new position on this as the Ethics Council. I hope we will soon be asked by the politicians to look at this again, but I would like to say one thing. It is really crucial that we don't pretend that a change in the debate about a general mandatory vaccine means that promises are broken or that politics haven't lived up to their promises, that they have failed. In the beginning of the year, or actually until the middle of this year, it wouldn't have been acceptable if the German state would have said, well, I don't trust my citizens. We immediately use a measure that's also affecting the basic rights of every citizen. It's right that we didn't do that from the start, but we also have to learn and we have to take into account that the situation has changed. We have seen that fewer people than we were probably all hoping for have gotten a vaccine, and that this affects all of us because we are in an extremely dangerous situation now. And so we have to reconsider. Maybe a vaccine mandate, a general mandate, is something we have to look at again. Now, there are different models and strategies for this. Would this be appropriate now? I think it's really important to be open to this. We shouldn't have a ban or prohibit the fact that we change our opinion. That is not appropriate in this situation. Mr. Wheeler, I would actually also like to hear what you have to say about this. We have received a very clear opinion here. Do we want to bring our health system to a breaking point with every new wave? I think a vaccine mandate is the only way around this, and this has been said by someone who works at a COVID hospital ward and really sees the consequences. You always talk about our options. Do you think a general vaccine mandate is an option here? Well, first of all, I agree with what the person, the doctor, if I got it right, from the ICU said. The only way is to have everyone immunized. This can either happen through an infection, that's the worst idea, that's a naive idea. Even if some people say, I'm completely healthy, my immune system is great, it's naive to think that this virus is not dangerous to you. Don't underestimate it. It's our common enemy, and immunization is the best way to fight it. My favorite option is the vaccine here, and I can only agree with Ms. Books. The times have changed. The situation is different now. You know that I said time and again that I'm really convinced that most people in Germany will choose this path because they understand it's the right thing to do, they understand that the vaccines are safe, and we have so much data and information by now also proving this. We have millions, billions of pieces of evidence that they are safe and effective, these vaccines. And if we don't manage to vaccinate a lot of people, even though we see that more and more people are getting a vaccine now, a vaccine mandate is an option that we should take into consideration. And what I'm going to say now is really important. I can only stress this now, and Mr. Sander also said this. I know that a lot of cancer surgery hasn't taken place. These are facts that we can prove. These surgeries couldn't take place because hospitals were swamped with COVID patients. I know that we are in an emergency situation in some regions, and this wave is just continuing, and the restrictions will become more and more severe. And we're in a crisis now, so I think in such a situation we shouldn't exclude anything explicitly, and so I can only agree with Ms. Books. Would you like to add anything? Because there's one more topic that I would like to touch upon. I'm skeptical regarding a general vaccine mandate in this pandemic. That's not new, everyone knows this, and I'm the first minister in a long time that has introduced a vaccine mandate in Germany, just to make sure that I'm not against vaccine mandates in general. We introduced the measles vaccination mandate for schools and nurseries, etc., and kindergartens, for example. So it's also very interesting, and my ministry is working together with the new majority in the Bundestag, in the parliament. And that's a mandate for certain facilities, like hospitals or nursing homes, where we have a lot of vulnerable people. And this is a legislative process that we are looking at. But I always try and look at the vaccine mandate as a whole picture. What does it do to society? How do we want to implement it? Will we have fines? And how do we get the fine from the people if they don't pay? I think an alternative should also be discussed. We have to talk about this. There are no taboos now. I have never liked taboos. We always have to openly debate everything. And that is 2G for all areas of life, all spheres of life. That's an indirect mandate, but it's easier to implement, because actually vaccine mandates are really hard to implement without everything breaking apart and falling apart. So I would like to say, okay, people, 2021 will be a year independent of how, or 2022 actually, independent of the incident rates, of the case rates, where we have a year of 2G. And if you want to go anywhere else than to the supermarket or the town hall, you have to be vaccinated. So that would be a clear message. So that's one of the options. We have to talk about all options. We all see what is happening here, because 11 million adults have decided not to get vaccinated, and everyone is suffering from that. I would like to use the last minutes that we have to also look beyond the German borders. We have one more guest now, a live guest. And just thinking of the new variant, we see how significant this question really is. We are not living on an island. Kaspar Haag, welcome. Please be brief, if I may ask you to be. Hi. Hi, thank you for having me. The head of the WHO, Mr. Ghebreyesus, said that he is not in favor of booster vaccinations for adults if millions of people are still waiting for their first shot in the world. So how can you actually say that booster shots are important now if so many people are still waiting for their first dose in the world? Well, it's an important and great question, I have to admit, because this is a dilemma that we are facing on a global level. I also spoke to Mr. Ghebreyesus in Geneva, in Berlin, with other people in the World Health Organization. We have to look at the whole picture. We are looking at a complete vaccination series, and for vulnerable groups, for older people, the booster is essential to be protected, at least for this group, and this there's no conflict with other groups in the world, other populations. But Germany has been committed to global health politics in the last 2 years, like no other country. We have actually also done a lot of good, because the US wanted to leave the global health community, and we are really committed and have done a lot here, but we can only be so committed if everything is right at home too. So we have to have the population's acceptance, and we have seen this really in practice now, because people said, okay, why did you give Bionic doses to other countries a few weeks ago if we need them now in Germany? And yes, maybe I would take another decision today. But back then, it was a conscious decision in order to help other parts of the world. We wanted to protect other populations too, and we are seeing what has happened in South Africa. We are only safe once everyone in the world is safe. And to make this possible, to have a good vaccination campaign and good protection here in Germany, and help the world actively at the same time, this is the big dilemma. There's an ethic dilemma here included as well. But looking back to the last 12 or 18 months, I think Germany has actually performed very well in this challenge. Also on a global level, we have sent 50% of the vaccines produced in Europe, when China, the US or the UK hardly gave anything to any other country. So I think Germany has a right to do both, to support our own citizens and to help the global population. We can do both, but it's a really good question and it's a general ethic question. But yes, Mr. Sander, of course, there's also a medical view or an immunization perspective, because if I understand it right, the more people are vaccinated, the less likely variants are to emerge. What do you think, also looking at the new variant Omicron? Well, generally speaking, we have seen that new virus variants that also can be more dangerous, and these variants have developed and they emerged in countries with a lot of infections. Virus mutations happen by accident and it often goes wrong, and sometimes viruses end up being superior to their sisters and brothers, so to speak. We saw this in the UK back then, we saw this in India. They had extremely many infections, and this is how Delta probably came about, and maybe this new variant emerged in Southern Africa. We don't really know where it developed. And they also don't have a lot of testing and sequencing in many countries, so we can't really tell where it developed. But of course, it's right that we have to immunize people in the whole world before we can actually be at peace and don't have to worry about a completely new variant. So independent of the fact that, of course, Mr. Spahn also just said this, we have a moral responsibility towards people to help people, and we are doing this. So there are really two sides here. Mr. Haag, thank you so much for this important question. I think we should have talked about this longer, but at least we have touched upon it. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, before we close today's session, Mr. Spahn, I would like to quickly talk about another aspect again. A question that we got. Please tell people that the vaccinated also have to be careful. Many people pretend they are completely protected and could be transmitting the virus. Mr. Wheeler, I would like to get back to what you said in the beginning, and that's reducing our contacts. Who are you talking to? Are you just talking to the vaccinated population who shouldn't go to big events, who maybe shouldn't meet with their whole family indoors, etc.? Who are you sending out this message to when you're talking about reducing contacts? Should we all do that? And to which extent? Maybe you can bring a bit more details into this, because it's really important. Well, this is exactly the point. Everyone should do this. We know that vaccinated people are not 100% safe from infections. We are looking at, depending on the statistics you're using, 60, 50, 70% of protection. So vaccinated people can also be infected. They will not get severely ill, but they can pass on the virus. So vaccinated people also have to make sure the virus doesn't spread. So in general, these contact restrictions also apply to vaccinated people. When you have to go to events, when you meet indoors, you should always wear a mask. We need this for all official events. We need a mask obligation, a mask mandate. I really don't understand how there can be official events that have been planned by event planners that don't have mask mandates anymore. Yes, it applies to everyone. Generally speaking, everyone. And if you can not hold any events, you shouldn't hold them, and also not meet people. It's not great news, I know that, but we are looking at a very difficult situation, and we know that these measures are effective. There are so many scientific publications on this now, it's very clear this applies to everyone. Thank you so much. You can find more information on zusammengegen-corona.de, corona-schutzimpfung.de, on the websites of the Robert Koch Institute and the Paul Ehrlich Institute. You can find a lot of information everywhere on new studies, new insights. Thank you, everyone. This has been a session with a lot of questions. We've heard a lot of experts who gave their opinion now. It's really great that we have so many experts in this country that really also try and work for the same goal, who appreciate each other and respect each other. This is what I always feel when you have these sessions, that you all respect each other. Mr. Spahn, you have the floor. Well, thank you also on my behalf for everyone who has joined us, who has discussed with us here, and everyone who has tuned in and tried to get new information, because we can see this at the moment. There's so much information circulating on WhatsApp, Facebook, and the social media, on the platforms, and it's hard to control this information, but there are a lot of questions and worries, and this is why we want to inform everyone and raise awareness. Today we talked about booster vaccinations that are important to protect you and your loved ones, but also to really curb the wave, the fourth wave that we are in. But I also want to point again to what Mr. Wheeler just said. We are probably in the worst situation of this pandemic in Germany. We just have to look to Bavaria, Thuringia, Baden-Württemberg, Saxony, and the hospitals there. This wave will now move to the west of Germany and also wash through Europe. Other federal states and countries will be affected by this. We don't know how bad the wave will be, how much stress it will put on our system, our health system, how many people will go to ICU and die. Well, this is something we still can't control. The wave is coming, but we can still control the wave to a certain extent in Germany, but we have to be decisive here on the state level, on the federal level. The government has to act, but you as an individual, as citizens, also have to take action, be responsible. We know how we can make a difference, and many of you are doing all they can. Thank you so much. You're being vaccinated, you're getting tested. Take care of yourself, and we would have loved to have a different situation, but we'll have to do that again in the next week. Please do that, and thank you very much.